want to introduce our speaker tonight, Bruce Hindmarsh. I'm thrilled to have him here. I've gotten to know him. He's a marvelous, godly man, undergraduate degree in Canada, and then he goes off to this little college called Christ Church at the University of Oxford, where he gets his graduate degrees in theology. But the nicest part about him is he cares about people. He cares about spiritual growth. He's been at Regent College over a decade working to help cultivate scholars that can minister within the church. True spirituality, the history of Christian spirituality is a course he's teaching right now, but it's something he models in his life. So would you join me in giving a warm Texas welcome, Bruce Hindmarsh.
Well, thank you, Mark and Becky. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed your hospitality and enjoyed being here, and the people I've had just a privilege to meet. Greetings from Regent College. Greetings from Canada. I apologize for the trade imbalance between our countries. We're working on that. We have some slides to go with this evening's presentation, and we couldn't get them to display quite right. So I assure you that in the 18th century, the moon wasn't quite as egg-shaped as it looks like, and that the 18th century figures that you'll look at were not particularly shorter and fatter than we are today. But I think they'll maybe help us a little bit with our theme, which is Evangelicals and the rise of science. About 300 years ago, Jonathan Edwards declared that there was no question of greater importance to humankind than this. What is the nature of true religion? I wonder if you agree. This question seemed urgent at the time. In fact, it stimulated the rise of a whole new movement within Christianity in the 18th century. Its leaders appealed to women and men to be true Christians rather than merely nominal believers. We refer to this new expression of Christianity as it emerges and coalesces. We refer to it as the modern evangelical movement or the evangelical revival. But it's important to say in this context, evangelical is not a label used to distinguish something as not Catholic or not liberal. And the movement had none of the political overtones that it has in modern America today. You have to wipe all that away when you think about this first generation. At the outset, evangelicals were distinguished, and they distinguished themselves by terms that denote intensity, an intensity of belief and commitment. Religious intensity, words like awakened rather than asleep. Serious Christians, real Christians, true religion. Gospel clergy were serious Christians who wished for their people to be awakened spiritually, to turn to Christ in such a way as to prove real Christians. So you can see how this question kind of shapes the movement. Again, this was felt to be a matter of some urgency. It appeared to many that modern Anglo-American society was becoming less religious. We might look back and talk about the rise of modernity, secularism, naturalism. At the time, Christian leaders described it in 18th century terms as the growth of luxury, we would say conspicuous consumption, the corruption of manners, we might talk about immorality, the spread of free thinking and infidelity, of unbelief, atheism and agnosticism. It amounts to the same thing. There seemed to be an acute need for a spiritual awakening from a kind of moral fog that had settled over a whole generation. Who are evangelicals? They were those who felt this situation to be a particular crisis. It called for conversion. The religious status quo was unacceptable, and someone had to light a fire. Soon enough, the ardor of a new evangelical spirituality appeared in the middle of the 18th century. There was a wave of individual conversions, renewed intensive small group fellowship, and community revivals. In all of this activity, the pressing question was simply, what does it mean for men and women to know God personally, to experience the life of God in the soul of man? In fact, this was the title of one of their favorite books. So a significant spiritual awakening in the North Atlantic resulted. But in my recent research, I couldn't help but notice that this happened at a critical time in the intellectual history of the West. The same generation that witnessed this revival, this was also the first generation to accept the basic postulates of Isaac Newton and to embrace the new science. This is a popular book called Astronomy Explained upon Sir Isaac Newton's Principle and Made Easy for Those Who Have Not Studied Mathematics. 1757, Isaac Newton for Dummies. But the rise of evangelicalism and the popular reception of modern science were happening in the same time period. I was fascinated by this. We might be accustomed today to think of popular evangelicalism, popular Protestantism, as inimical, opposed to science, for any number of reasons. But with only a few exceptions, it really was not so in the beginning. In my lecture this evening, I would like to argue that English-speaking evangelicals in the beginning largely accepted the new science, but they nested its insights, the insights of materialist science, within a larger vision of the universe, in which God remained a living, animate presence. The keynote of their response to the natural world revealed by science was wonder, love, and praise. And their devotion acted to re-enchant the universe that the new science had seemingly drained of transcendence. We'll look this evening at two well-known leaders from either side of the Atlantic, Jonathan Edwards and John Wesley, and then we'll look at two less well-known figures to round out this picture, the poet James Harvey and the painter and amateur astronomer John Russell. Some of you know Charles Wesley's famous hymn, "Love Divine, All Loves Excelling," still sometimes sung at weddings by the well-meaning sister of the bride. Love divine, all loves excelling, joy of heaven to earth come down. It's a celebration of love come down. God's love come down to us in the coming of Jesus Christ into the world. The hymn ends, you may remember, on a note of ecstasy and prayer, anticipating the day when we will be changed from glory into glory. We cast our crowns before thee, lost in wonder, love, and praise. Now, lay Methodists, lay people would have been regularly singing this hymn by the time that Charles's brother, John, published his multi-volume Survey of the Wisdom of God in Creation in 1763. Here, John presented the latest findings of 18th century science in the post-Newtonian world, the post-Newtonian period. Wesley continued to revise and add to this work, and by the fourth edition, this compendium extended to 5 volumes. The conclusion of his preface in all 4 editions takes us full circle to the close of his brother's hymn. John hoped, he wrote, that his account would serve to warm our hearts, his account of science, and to fill our mouths with wonder, love, and praise. Notice, the heart strangely warmed by God in redemption was now to be warmed likewise in the contemplation of creation. For the Wesleys, the work of God in creation and redemption called forth the same religious emotions. It invited the same response of doxology. It even called forth the very same words. Evangelical devotion, worship, proved enormously significant in just this way for cultivating a worshipful response to the natural world. A readiness to perceive God's continued presence in the world revealed by science. There's real intellectual significance to this, in the way evangelical devotion sustained a sense that God is immediately present, even while the new science was remaking the face of nature in modern terms. At this critical moment, evangelical devotion did what I call a metaphysical work above its pay grade. It punches above its weight. The devotional instinct to regard nothing as separate from God passed over into their view of the material world as radiant with God's presence. Remember, this is precisely the moment at which Newtonianism is being received into mainstream culture, radically altering metaphysical assumptions that had informed Christian spirituality from earliest times. These are the key works. The Principia, and it's translated into English in the 1720s, and the Opticks, which is published in 1704 in English. So Newtonianism unites terrestrial, this worldly, and celestial mechanics in a physics founded on particulate matter and motions, particles in motion. It radically revises traditional cosmology, replacing the form principle, the sense that the universe is informed, animated, with a doctrine of the inertness of matter. Matter is inert. The new science is saying that literally now there's nothing inside matter. There's no apparent spirituality to the observable universe. Natural objects have been spiritually scoured, metaphysically eviscerated, and all that's left is surfaces. The shift is spiritually troubling enough for the philosopher Ralph Cudworth to write nearly 1,000 pages from his college study in late 17th century Cambridge, trying to expose what he thought was the sheer atheism implied by science, quote, exploding final causes. The word dead comes up again and again in his description of the world described by the new natural philosophy. It was a world of, he said, dead and stupid matter, a dead cadaverous thing, a dead and wooden world, and so on. The evangelicals came on the scene after the initial ferment over all this had largely subsided. There were debates. A whole generation of religious thinkers had debated how best to respond to the Newtonian system and had developed a system of natural theology reasoning from the Newtonian universe, what we could reason about this, about God, so-called physico-theology, or theology from physics. But the evangelicals did something more, I think. Rational arguments from design and from nature were well and good, but there had to be a more direct and immediate experience of God in nature, an immediate consciousness that God is still here and present. Time and again, their devotion turned to consider the physical world that science was revealing, and they saw it as if with spiritual senses. It's seeing nature transfigured. Every tree is a burning bush. Every cloud is a pillar of fire. To Jonathan Edwards and John Wesley, either side of the Atlantic, as with so many others, God could still be vividly perceived in each created thing. Indeed, no one better illustrates the way evangelicalism arose in this first properly post-Newtonian generation than the young Jonathan Edwards. During his years as a student and tutor at Yale College, before he moved to be an assistant minister at Northampton, Massachusetts, at 23 years of age, we can track his reading. In fact, Sir Isaac Newton himself contributed a copy of his Principia and Opticks to the collection of more than 800 volumes given to establish the library at the infant college. And these books, nicely representing the new natural philosophy, were taken out of their crates towards the close of 1718 in the middle of Edwards' undergraduate education at Yale. It would be a time of profound intellectual awakening. The new physics quite literally arrived on his doorstep. Edwards soon accumulated a considerable set of notes on natural philosophy. Importantly, he's taking notes on natural philosophy about all sorts of things, about science. At the same time, he began to have those spiritual experiences he later described as an inward sweet delight in God and divine things. His intellectual awakening and his spiritual awakening are proceeding together as a student. Here we have a key early evangelical figure thinking deeply about science and faith. Looking at all of his scientific papers together, reading them all together, it's clear he'd established the major outlines of his response to the new natural philosophy or science before moving to Northampton in 1726 to be a pastor. In these working notes, he recorded all those things in natural philosophy he felt needed to be considered and fully and written fully about. That was the title of his notebook. I like that title. Things to be considered and written fully about. My daughter started a journal and gave it that title. Evidently, there were a lot. Why thunder a great way off sounds grum, but nearer sounds very sharp. How arterial blood descends and venal blood ascends according to the laws of hydrostatics. Why the fixed stars twinkle but not the planets? How animals move and contract their muscles by the sending forth of animal spirits? Why we need not think that the soul is in the fingers just because we have feelings in our fingers? Why there are so many more frigomorphic particles in winter than summer? Why all the mountains lean to the west? How trees grow from seed with regular patterns? Why some bubbles last longer than others? How waves in the water spread like hills and valleys? How levers amplify force? Why the sea is salty? And the list goes on. There seemed no end to his intellectual curiosity about the natural world. He also displayed the characteristically Newtonian concern for observation, mathematical reasoning, and even to a limited extent, experimentation. Perhaps it's just as well he didn't proceed too far by experiment. In his notebooks, he said he wanted to prove that particles of matter fitted together fast enough could rebound with an almost infinite velocity. And he thought he could demonstrate this by computing how much motion there might be in a square inch of gunpowder set on fire. He would later describe revival as a surprising work of God. This experiment with gunpowder might have produced a whole different sort of surprising work. Although Edwards accepted the basic Newtonian postulate of particulate matter and motion, he saw immediately the deeper metaphysical questions, the philosophical questions raised by the rise of mechanical philosophy with its substance dualism, spirit and matter, thought and extension. He devoted significant attention, therefore, to considering closely the nature of void space. What does it mean that space is empty? Particulate matter, the Newtonian principle of attraction at a distance, gravity, and so on. Ultimately, to meet the challenges of natural philosophy, he set out a more radical and comprehensive philosophy, and I can't emphasize how comprehensive it was, than any other evangelical of his generation. One which proceeded expressly from his evangelical spirituality, his devotion. We can't do it justice here tonight, but it's clear that his natural philosophy was inseparable from his new sense of the immediate presence of God that he began to experience in the spring of 1721. It was the immediate sense of God's presence that Edwards simply could not banish from the universe. God was not to be regarded as remote, but was intimately near. In his notebooks, Edwards would often pause to admire the wisdom, the power, the goodness of God in the design of creation. After the manner of these natural theologians, these physical theologians, but ultimately he was after bigger game. His wife Sarah's ecstatic experience of God's presence that he narrates was something that she described as a sense of God's nearness to me and my dearness to him. It's a lovely phrase. I think this expresses well the spirituality that was basic to Edwards' whole intellectual project, his nearness to me and my dearness to him. He works out the sense of God's immediate presence in a way that is principio, a basic axiom for physics and metaphysics, for Edwards' psychology, for Edwards' ethics. It works across the whole range of his project, as philosophers call it. Writing his personal narrative, looking back in 1740, Edwards wrote about the vivid religious consciousness that began for him as an MA student at Yale in the midst of his investigations into science. His religious contemplation brought with it, he said, a new sort of affection. This passed over into his views of nature. Quote, the appearance of everything was altered. There seemed to be, as it were, a calm, sweet cast or appearance of divine glory in almost everything. The crucial difference now was that the wisdom, goodness, and power of God was not arrived at as the conclusion of a process of ratiocination, an inference, a reasoning from the apparent design of the universe. These divine qualities instead are being grasped immediately, intuitively, and directly with a kind of devotional intelligence. The divine glory was not just deducible from nature, it was perceived in nature. And so all the objects of inquiry in his natural philosophy notebooks now shone with a borrowed light from beyond the walls of the world. God's excellency, he said, seemed to appear in everything. In the sun, the moon, and stars. In the clouds and the blue sky. In the grass, flowers, trees. In the water and all nature. He grasped all these things with a direct devotional intelligence that concentrated his powers. These natural phenomena used to greatly fix my mind, he said. I often used to sit and view the moon for a long time, and so in the daytime spent much time in viewing the clouds and the sky to behold the sweet glory of God in these things. Again, the all-important word in this sentence is that small preposition, in. The thunder and lightning that he pondered in his notebooks as grum or sharp that used to terrify him, now this was the majestic and awful voice, he says, of God himself. We must remember, this is the same young man who seems to be seeing God immediately present in the sun, the moon, and the stars, resplendent with divine glory, who is concurrently, at the same time, in his science notebooks, trying to calculate how much of the surface of the semi-hemisphere of the eye it was that could take in the individual rays of light from the star Sirius. He figured it was 8 million millionths of an inch. Took him several lines to write this out mathematically. A similar attitude can be seen in the many-sided engagement of John Wesley with science. Wesley was remarkably well-versed in the natural philosophy of his era, and we've had occasion already to refer to his survey. But his interest in the findings of natural philosophy began earlier. He learned the Cartesian and Newtonian systems already as an undergraduate at Oxford. Indeed, we have his notebooks and his reading lists from this period, and it's frankly astonishing to witness the extent and the range of his reading. The foundation laid during these years was one he would build on for the rest of his life. Wesley never stopped reading scientific literature or reflecting on its significance for the life of faith. Attending some public scientific experiments in 1753, Wesley wrote, "How well do philosophy, like natural philosophy or science, and religion agree in a man of sound understanding." This would be his attitude in general to the expanding scientific knowledge of the natural world during the century. Wesley was manifestly at the forefront of his culture in disseminating the knowledge of the new natural philosophy, the new science, to a wide audience that includes artisans, tradesmen, working people, the middling sort. It was such as these that Wesley had in mind as readers for his survey, which he also serialized in his magazine. He made science a part of the curriculum for the pupils at his grammar school near Bristol, including tackling Newton's Principia. Wesley was probably correct, too, that his survey, that multi-volume survey of science, was, he said, the most complete thing of its kind of any in the English tongue. I think he was probably right. He made it part of his program of instructing his own lay preachers. Think about that, part of their theological education. Spending time, he says, and so every morning, reading aloud to them from its pages on science. He obviously enjoyed this. He said it was just like the old days when he was a tutor at Oxford. When we add to this program Wesley's other publications referring to science, his writings on electricity and medicine and so on, It's clear that Methodism, as it emerged in this period, fostered a popular culture in which scientific literacy was valued and widely disseminated. It's one of the places where this Newtonianism is being received into culture. He was most concerned with the utility of natural knowledge, and nowhere more so than its application to health, hygiene, nutrition, and medical treatment, where it pays off. His reading of medical treatises was also extensive. Beginning at Oxford and continuing throughout his adult life, he read medicine. The concern to care for the bodies and souls, both of his followers, to protect them from needless expense, this drove him deeper into his study of medicine in the 1740s. In 1747, this bore fruit in the first edition of his book, Primitive Physic, an inexpensive medical handbook that was continuously reprinted, numbering some 23 editions by the end of his life. In the first edition, Wesley addresses 243 medical conditions and offers 725 recipes. He appealed, and he also had kind of office hours in Bristol and Newcastle and other places when people could come to him for advice about medicine. He appealed in this and other medical writing to a commonsensical empiricism, what's known to work, that he understood as timeless or primitive, long-lasting wisdom. But he could also list among his sources several recent medical writers informed by Newtonianism. He emphasizes the time-tested importance of regimen, simple remedies, the so-called non-naturals, air, food, exercise, sleep, and so on. I remember him writing to a woman, Anne Bolton, in Whitney near Oxford, who was depressed, and he said she needed to daily ride the wooden horse. And I was thinking, what's the wooden horse? And it was a kind of plank between, that you would kind of put a saddle on and bounce up and down inside, sort of a cross between, a jolly jumper and an exercise bike to exercise. But these non-naturals, as they called it, non-natural to the body, air, food, exercise, sleep, and so on. So despite the rise of iatrochemical, medical chemical, corpuscular, mechanical theories, Wesley is in line with other 18th century physicians in having recourse to an empirical standard and a body of classical knowledge from the past. So that's another example of his reception and dissemination of science. Evangelicals were active consumers and conveyors of natural knowledge. They were less often its producers. But in Wesley's Primitive Physic, we find him willing to advance the knowledge of the natural world by experiment. Remember, we talked about that element and wondered whether Edwards should experiment. Wesley was willing to experiment on himself. After 1761, he wrote beside a number of his remedies, in parenthesis, tried. He literally took his own medicine. So, for one having trouble voiding, urine by drops with heat and pain, he said, drink nothing but lemonade. Tried. Evidently, it worked for him. So Wesley read the new science, he popularized it, he drew upon it, together with ancient sources for practical medical advice. But the best example, I think, of Wesley's practical interest in science, motivated by charitable concern for the poor and the sick, is his interest in the new discoveries being made relating to electricity and the therapeutic use he made of these with the new electrical machines. This is the one from Wesley Chapel in London that still exists, these new electrical machines. In November 1760, he wrote that he had collected various new remedies tried by himself or others, some of which were highly effective, but one, he said, I must aver from personal knowledge, grounded on 1,000 experiments, to be far superior to all the other medicines I have known. I mean electricity. Other evangelical leaders use forms of electrotherapy, and I've seen several of these electrical machines that are still on display various places. Wesley went to see the electrical experiments in the late 1740s, and his wonder and amazement were genuine. Benjamin Franklin and others were experimenting with the Leyden jar, the first form of a capacitor for storing static electricity. And electricity soon became a new frontier for popular science at mid-century. Isaac Newton himself had speculated about electricity as a fundamental force. and there now seemed no end to the promise of electricity in theory and practice, and soon machines of the sort that Wesley was using were readily available, and just about everything was being tested and electrified. You know, he said it was a cure for baldness, electrify it daily. He had all sorts of uses for electricity. And I used to kind of make fun of these and get laughs with students until I went to my physiotherapist, and at the end they attached electrodes to my leg to run electricity through it. And I thought, oh, maybe Wesley is a kind of forerunner of electrotherapy. He's widely read in the experimental literature, and in 1760 he published his own account of electricity, the desideratum, the desired thing, or electricity made plain and useful by a lover of mankind and of common sense. Gotta love 18th century titles. Even just from this title, it's plain how Wesley's hopes were tied to the practical possibilities of electricity. He had high hopes. There cannot be in nature any such thing as an absolute panacea, he wrote, a medicine that will cure every disease incident to the human body. But if there could, electricity would bid fairer for it than anything in the world. Electricity was an unparalleled remedy, he thought, the long-hoped-for desideratum, the general and rarely failing remedy in nervous cases of every kind. There had been much speculation about how the nervous system worked in the 18th century, mostly on the model of vascular circulation discovered by William Harvey with respect to the blood. The question is, what were the very fine nervous juices carried in the semi-porous fibers of the nerves? Here, too, Wesley found electricity a promising candidate. Perhaps, if the nerves are really perforated, as is now generally supposed, the electric ether is the only fluid in the universe which is fine enough to move through them. And what if the nervous juice itself be found to be a fluid of this kind? If so, it is no wonder that it has always eluded the search of the most accurate naturalists. It's interesting to see this kind of speculation going on. Beyond physiology, Wesley also speculated about the role of electricity in basic Newtonian physics, saying that this elementary fire appeared as a candidate for Newton's speculative ether, a fluid far more subtle than air, which is everywhere diffused through all space, which surrounds the earth and pervades every part of it. Wesley recognized that electricity answered to the inertness of matter in Newton's cosmos as a more active principle, so fine, so quick, so extensive, that all other matter, he says, seems to be only the body, and this the soul of the universe. So it's like he's pressing towards questions of fundamental forces, as we would say today. But in the end, though, Wesley restrained this speculative curiosity and maintained the same attitude to electricity as to natural philosophy generally. He said, I am much more concerned with the physical part, knowing of how great importance this is, how much sickness and pain may be prevented or removed, how many lives saved by this unparalleled remedy. It was 1,000 medicines in one, he hoped. And so he traveled around with his electrical machine everywhere he went, and he revised his primitive physic to include 50 conditions which would benefit from electrical therapy. Empirical to the end, Wesley revised his medical manual over the years as he continued to learn what worked and what didn't. One of the most important revisions was of the prescription for an emetic, makes you vomit, that in the manual had mistakenly called for 1 or 2 drams rather than grains of distilled verdigris, a copper sulfate. Something that would have resulted in a lethal overdose. A dram was 60 times more than a grain. Used the wrong word. For this, Wesley was pilloried in the press with one headline reading, O thou man of God, there is death in thy pot. Quoting 2 Kings 4:40. Oops. Another critic claimed Wesley's remedy for gout, the application of 2 raw beefsteaks changed every 12 hours, had killed the Dean of Norwich. It could be tricky to popularize science then, as now. So he revised as he went. Most importantly, though, Wesley's evangelical devotion, his spirit of worship, like that of Edwards, acted instinctively to re-enchant the world the new science had made. Remember, in Ralph Cudworth's terms, a dead, cadaverous thing. This comes through in some of Wesley's sermons. He celebrated scientific findings, but argued that the light of nature, just natural reasoning from nature to God, that in itself still amounted, he said, to no more than a faint twilight compared to the dazzling light of God's word. And nature could never therefore produce what he called a demonstrative conviction and a lengthos of spiritual things. This required the revelation of Christ by the light of faith. Through conversion, God opens the spiritual eyes of believers and pours divine light into their soul, and they begin to see God and the things of God. This meant that the human person, renewed by the Spirit, could be conscious of God's presence everywhere in the material world. He said they see him in the height above, in the depth beneath. They see him filling all in all. The pure in heart see all things, full of God. Wesley's rhetoric rises with his theme. They see him in the firmament of heaven, in the moon walking in brightness, in the sun when he rejoiceth as a giant to run his course, quoting Psalm 19. They see God in the wind and the rain and the fields. This is now directly counter to any metaphysical naturalism. He says we are to see the Creator in the glass, that is the mirror of every creature. Look upon nothing as separate from God, which indeed is a kind of practical atheism, he says. And in a final crescendo, he draws again on the language of an earlier age, saying that God holds all things together as the anima mundi, the spirit of the world, for he pervades and actuates the whole frame, the whole created frame, and is in a true sense the soul of the universe. So over against this kind of teleological narrative of the rise of materialist science, that kind of dominant narrative, we must set these very robust examples of Edwards and Wesley, of evangelical conversion re-enchanting the Newtonian universe from top to bottom. Science, yes, but materialism, no. Well, Wesley and Edwards are still relatively well known today, but the evangelical who likely had greatest influence on this entire generation in these things is someone largely forgotten now. James Harvey had been a part of John Wesley's Holy Club, the Oxford Methodists at Oxford. He was a hard-working parish priest, often in poor health, but Harvey still found time to write and published a series of prose poems on nature. He wrote in an elevated style. Most of us today would find him too flowery. He's difficult to read. But his mid-century audience ate it up. His collection of meditations and contemplations, this book was immensely popular. There were over 100 editions by the end of the century, including imprints in London, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Dublin, Belfast, New York, Philadelphia, Boston. Sales are huge, with editions typically running in the range of 5,000 to 6,000. Even today, any author would love that. It is worth recalling this popularity and the influence of Harvey, since his style went out of fashion in the 19th century. He was self-consciously imitating a style found among contemporary philosophers. And this was in part an evangelical tactic. It was, he said, to bait the gospel hook agreeably to prevailing taste. But his response to the natural world was no less genuine for this, and he clearly found an eager and receptive audience. He was also incidentally read carefully by both Wesley and Edwards. Okay, so very early, Harvey set out his program. We should always view the visible system with an evangelical telescope and an evangelical microscope. Regarding Christ Jesus as the great projector and architect that planned and executed the amazing scheme. This is the Christian's natural philosophy. Gospel in this, or evangelical in this context, means the gospel about Christ. It's a theological term. His motivation is equally clear. Did we carefully attend to this leading principle in all our examinations of nature, it would doubtless be a most powerful means of enkindling our love and strengthening our faith. So read science, he says, and it will enkindle your love and strengthen your faith. When one looks around at all the million substances, he says, one should carry a single transporting, elevating reflection, namely, The maker of them all died on the cross for me. How can I remain any longer indifferent? Harvey developed a set of theologically robust principles for contemplating what he called the teeming earth and the smiling skies. And all of these principles are Christ-centered. First of all, he articulates the patristic creatio ex nihilo doctrine, creation out of nothing. Christ made them when they were not. He fetched them up from utter darkness and gave them both their being and their beauty. Secondly, he affirms the cosmic scope of Christ's redemption. Christ recovered them when they were forfeited. Thirdly, he points to the contingency of the created order, saying Christ upholds them, which would otherwise tumble into ruin. Or more poetically, he says, his finger rolls the seasons round and presides over all the celestial revolutions. And finally, he extends his contingency to life itself, fusing the ancient language of vitalism and emanation with the Newtonian idea of inert matter, saying Christ actuates them, which would otherwise be lifeless and insignificant. He only has life. And whatever operates by an emanation from his all-sufficiency. Really interesting. As he continues, his metaphor for this contingency or dependence is economic, like we depend economically on something. But he merges this with the Pauline notion of fullness. Pensioners they are, he says. Pensioners on his bounty, and borrow their all from his fullness. Harvey would often turn thus to texts in St. Paul's letter to the Colossians for this cosmic Christological doctrine. He defended what he was doing as more than the lawless flight of fancy. I'm not just playing around with my imagination. Because his observations were grounded, he said, grounded in this grand doctrine, the hinge upon which they all turn, namely that all things were created by him and for him, and that in him all things consist. Colossians 1, 16 and 17. All told then, his contemplation of nature, now we're talking about seeing God in nature, but his capacity to do this is deeply considered theologically. In Harvey's final section of this book, the contemplations on the starry heavens, and astronomy is sort of the leading scientific field right now, it's clear how wholeheartedly he embraced Newtonianism and observational astronomy within this theological vision. In fact, he adds a prefatory note to the reader saying, it may be unaccountable to an unlearned reader that astronomers should speak such amazing things, and speak them with such an air of assurance concerning the distances and the magnitudes and the motions and the relations of the heavenly bodies. Harvey reassures his uneducated reader, consider the cases of the eclipses, and with what exactness they are calculated. They are not only foretold, but the very instant of their beginning is determined, and this can be done down to the nicety of a moment, he says, and calculated hundreds of years into the future. All this, he says, is a matter of fact, absolutely indisputable. So the principles upon which science is making these calculations, he says, this is not mere conjecture or precarious supposition. This has a real and certain foundation, he says, in the nature and constitution of things. That's a pretty robust defense of empirical science. Still, after all this had been said, he added that these things were still supremely objects of admiration rather than of science. Science is taken up into devotion. These sentiments were illustrated for the reader in a frontispiece that Harvey added to the second volume of the third edition. This is the frontispiece. He added a 2-page explanation. In the picture, there is observational astronomy at work on the left. I don't know if you can see that. A telescope pointed toward the stars. There is also a natural philosopher on the right, instructing students according to the Newtonian hypothesis. There's a book sticking out from under the schematic of the planetary orbits. that prominently displays, quote, the great author's name, Isaac Newton. Right next to Newton's name, we can read the Latin words Inerant Gloriam Dei on the map, words from the opening of Psalm 19 explaining that heavens declare the glory of God. Another student, head bowed, in an attitude of humility, is unfurling a diagram illustrating the centrifugal and centripetal forces that combine in perfect balance in the Newtonian system to keep the planets in their orbits. Here the Latin motto is Sic gratia Dei, or such is the operation of divine grace. The obelisk, by the way, is a reminder of ancient timekeeping and place marking in astronomy. But amidst all this scientific activity, the key figure in the picture is the one most brightly illuminated in the middle, just left of center on his knees. He is, we find, overwhelmed, this youth in the middle, overwhelmed with veneration for the Almighty Maker, in a transport of gratitude and a profound posture of adoration. He is positioned in the middle between astronomy and observational astronomy and natural philosophy, right in between them. And he provides the exemplary response of wonder, love, and praise, this figure does. In Harvey, then, we see something more than an emblematic imagination, just mere fancy, making things up and drawing sweet little analogies from nature. Something passing over into something more transcendental or sacramental or, to use a medieval word, anagogical. Whatever is pleasurable or charming below, Harvey says, let it raise my desire to those sublime delights which are above, which will yield not partial but perfect felicity. Here for a moment Virgil leads to Beatrice. Turning again to Pauline Christology, Harvey continues, yes, my soul, let these beauties in miniature always remind thee of that glorious person in whom dwells all the fullness of God and of the Godhead bodily. Let these little emanations teach thee to thirst after the eternal fountain. He rises to contemplate the whole compass of finite perfection, the universe. And he says that it is all only a faint ray shot from that immense source. It is a small drop derived from that inexhaustible ocean of all good. Somehow he has grafted onto his Newtonianism the sort of transcendental language, the very same metaphors that one finds in a much earlier age, in Augustine or Abbé Suger or Henry Moore and so on. In one sense, then, his project is to develop a new religious consciousness or aesthetic for a generation of Newtonian readers. To appreciate his response to the natural world, described by science, three features can be picked out for the way he treats these in his meditations. First of all, the vast dimensions of the universe, the nature of void space or empty space, and then the fundamental forces of attraction, gravity. First then, as for many others, Harvey was led often from his contemplation of the sheer magnitude of the Newtonian universe to experience a kind of astonished awe. It's really big. He takes the reader in his contemplations of the starry heavens, ever upward, soaring beyond the moon, through the planets, to wing your way, he says, to the highest apparent star. What would you see there? Only other skies expanded, and other suns, and other star systems in unknown profusion through the boundless dimensions of space. And after all this, he says, you're only in the suburbs of creation. Clearly, he's got a keen sense for the infinite. And he was aware that the as yet undetectable stellar parallax implied unfathomable distances. And so he tries to recreate this sense for the reader. But then suddenly he turns all this on its head, saying that all this vastness, this prodigious extent of space, is comparatively a mathematical point in God's presence. He's vividly responsive to the mental vertigo, the dizziness produced by contemplating Newtonian space. My very thoughts, he says, are lost in this abyss of space. Now, for the French thinker Fontenelle, This sort of contemplation led to a profound sense of being alone in the universe, alienation, insignificance. But Harvey provides a different exemplary response. He says, "How I am overwhelmed with awe and sunk in the lowest prostration of mind. It leads to worship." The response of Harvey and Fontenelle to the vastness of space in the new cosmology may be compared to the reactions people had to the famous pale blue dot photograph taken by the Voyager 1 spacecraft 29 years ago on February 14th, 1990, from a distance of more than 6 billion kilometers as the probe was leaving our solar system. In the image of Earth, we find Earth is a mere point of light, a crescent only 0.12 of a pixel in size. Carl Sagan famously captured the feelings of a generation when he wrote about this. Look again at that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, every saint, every sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. For Harvey, the awareness of how vast the universe is led him to an intensified appreciation for the condescension of God to save the human race, for it measured the extent to which Christ humbled himself to save us. Behold this immense expanse, he says, and admire the condescension of thy God. Love come down. Space was, in the Newtonian system, vast, but it was also, secondly, empty. And for Harvey, this pointed to the sheer contingency of material worlds. We've used that word before. His favorite metaphor for this was to describe the earth as pendant or pendulous, hanging, like you hang a picture, hanging in Newton's speculative rarefied ether. What holds up the planets and the stellar orbs in space? Are they hung in golden adamantine chains? Rest they their enormous load on rocks of marble or columns of brass? No, he says, they are pendulous in fluid ether. So what makes them immovably fixed in their places? It is the work of God alone, he says. He hangs the earth and all the ethereal globes upon nothing. He rounded in his palm those dreadfully large globes, which are pendulous in the vault of heaven, and by him they are suspended and cannot be shaken. The metaphysical correlate to empty space is not atheism for him, but the sense that everything is held in existence. It is pendant by a God of love and faithfulness. The psalmist's repeated refrain that divine love and faithfulness reach to the skies has simply taken on a vast Newtonian dimension for Harvey. Thirdly, in dealing with the attractive forces of gravity and cohesion, Harvey saw both a beautiful simplicity in the design of the universe and a prodigious ballast, something that balances everything. It composes the equilibrium and constitutes the stability of things, he said. Attraction is the great chain which forms the connections of universal nature. It raised the question that Harvey knew everyone was asking. What is it? What is attraction? What is gravity? And so Harvey asks, is it a quality in its existence inseparable from matter in its acting, independent of the deity? By this point, it will be no surprise to the reader that he answers quite the reverse. It's the very finger of God, the constant impression of divine power, a principle neither innate in matter nor intelligible by mortals. He does not quite equate gravity with the Holy Spirit in a directly vitalist way, but he's willing to say gravity bears considerable analogy to the agency of the Holy Ghost. And it's like he's pressing towards a question of what we would call today fundamental forces in physics, electromagnetism, gravity, strong and weak nuclear force, and saying that in the fundamental forces, we see something like the work of the Holy Spirit. In the end, he concludes that even if he could see as far into things as Isaac Newton, still, he says, my vision would be as dim as what a mole sees emerging from a hole in the ground. What really matters is worship. Having now walked and worshipped in this universal temple, he says, having cast an eye of reason and devotion over all of it, having discovered an infinitude of worlds, having met the deity in every view, he says, it only remains to close with a hymn of praise. And so he closes with a hymn. That's our third case study. In my chapters on science in my recent book, I look at another 7 evangelical figures who give us parallel kinds of responses. But I would like to turn briefly to just one of these as a final case study, to the accomplished painter, portrait painter, and devoted amateur astronomer. We're looking now at a scientist, practicing scientist, John Russell. Devoted. I said a devoted astronomer. Yes, he is devoted. Over more than 2 decades, he made detailed lunar observations for some 6 hours a night, typically staying up till 2 or 3 in the morning. He was the foremost pastelist of his generation, and he produced the largest, most accurate, and most beautiful pictures of the moon that had ever been seen. On my last trip to Oxford, I visited the Museum of the History of Science in Oxford, which has a collection of some 200 of his studies, and an exquisite monumental pastel from 1795. It hangs right in the grand staircase. A picture of a gibbous moon hanging in empty space that measures almost 5 feet square. It takes your breath away. The museum also has the 12-inch mechanical globe of the moon in copper plate and detailed relief that he produced shortly after this painting, capable of showing all the librations, the shifting edges of the moon in its orbit, which he advertised as a selenographia. Selene was in Greek mythology, the goddess of the moon. It's an amazing mechanical globe. The earliest of his studies of the moon in the collection at Oxford dates from 1764, and it bears this inscription. It says, "This is the first drawing I ever made of the moon, J.R. John Russell, in the garden of John Bacon, another artist, 17 Newman Street in Oxford." This was the same year that Russell experienced an evangelical conversion. The cover of the first of his personal diaries, it's at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. The cover of his diary has a drawing of Golgotha, of Calvary, set in a barren wilderness with an open Bible in the foreground and the written declaration, John Russell, converted September 30, 1764. I taught age 19, about a half an hour after 7 o'clock in the evening. How's that for precision? 7:30 p.m. he's converted. So if the skies are clear, that would leave him about 6 or 7 hours to look at the moon. As for Edwards, his sense of things spiritual and celestial awakened together. His painstaking study of the moon, this is all after hours. This is volunteer. He made his living as a painter. His career as an 18th century artist is distinguished. He showed as a painter at the first exhibition of the Royal Academy in 1769. He continued to show every year until his death. He produced more than 1,200 pastels over his career, as well as a number of oils and miniatures. In 1788, he's a full academician, he's receiving royal commissions, and he's soon fetching prices in the same range as the president of the Royal Society, Joshua Reynolds, about 30 guineas a head. Those that sat to him included aristocrats, clergy, scientists, famous actors and actresses. He was a master of the technique that they call smudging, sweetening with the finger, the pastels. No one could match his brilliant colors or his coatings. He had to be a good chemist, he said, and he made his own pastels, and he wrote what became the standard handbook in the field, used well into the 19th century. But for all this public recognition as an artist, he remained outspoken in his evangelical commitments, regardless of the company. After his conversion, his proselytizing of the servants while he was an apprentice brought him into conflict with his master. His master would swear at him while he was trying to pray with the servants. During his first commission at a country house, he asked his sitter, Lady Montague, if they could have a private conversation about the picture. This was his sly way, he says in his diary, to get her alone, by means of which I hope to have an opportunity of speaking about Jesus. Lord Montague only barely tolerated him, putting up with him for his skill as an artist, but regretting bringing such a fanatic into his house. This was typical. It has led one modern art historian to be quite unrestrained in the simple conclusion, quote, Russell was an absolute pain. Russell never lost an opportunity to speak on religious matter. At Lord Aylesford's in 1768, he was invited to tea. Quote, I perceived he wanted me gone, he confided to his diary, but I thought fit to break through good manners rather than withhold a blessing from a child of God, and stayed 4 hours. Although Russell has been regarded by art historians as eccentric, there was in fact a deep consonance between his artistic vocation and his natural theology. He looked out on the night sky with devotion. When in December 1767 he was in a lukewarm frame, he's a bit depressed, he recorded in his diary that contemplating the sight of the stars was made good use of to free me from it. 5 months later, he wrote similarly, tonight, being in the street, I had a sight of the stars that God was pleased to preach to me from, and I had my soul filled with the hopes of blessed immortality. What we observe, I think, supremely in Russell, though, is something even more than this, namely the union of art and science with worship. There was still considerable common ground between art and science in the 18th century, and it was only in the following century that this would be replaced by the more dualistic approach to natural knowledge, still evident today as we speak of the arts and sciences. Russell was aware that close attention to detail in astronomy involved a kind of loving aesthetic attention. There's a long letter written by Russell in 1789 that describes his approach to portraying the moon both justly and beautifully. Since he first saw the moon through a telescope and it took his breath away, he was especially observant of the effect of different conditions of light and darkness on the features of the moon. His art training made him especially conscious that one could not simply observe a depression or an elevation in the direct light of a full moon and see the same things as in the oblique light of a gibbous moon. He was concerned to represent well the aesthetic quality of what he simply called this beautiful object. But it was this very mode of attention, aesthetically, that also enabled him to see things others had missed. His scientific insight was the result of considering the moon artistically in that proportion of light and dark, he said, by which all pleasurable distinction of character is produced. Here's one of the drawings from his diary, emphasizing the light and dark shading. Not yet, then, was there the suggestion of two kinds of truth, the publicly accredited truths of hard science and the softer, more subjective truths of art. Holding these things together, as he did, would be more difficult within a generation. There is one detail that I want to close with in Russell's lunar studies that offers an especially delightful illustration of his union of art and science with devotion. The promontorium Heraclides on the moon's surface juts out into the Mare Imbrium, the largest of the seas, the largest crater, I think, in the solar system, the Sea of Showers, near where Apollo 15 landed. And it had been noticed under a certain light to look like the outline of a woman's head in profile. You can see that there. Here's that arrow points to where this promontory is. This is where Apollo 15 landed. And from Russell's moon globe, you can kind of see a little bit here, the picture. This is the blowing it up from the moon globe. If I turn it around like that, you can kind of see the woman's figure there that he's drawing with a certain kind of grace. Here it is from the gores. You can see again the figure. Between 1787 and 1789, he did several sketches of this maiden in the moon. The beauty and grace of these studies may be placed side by side with specimens of the detailed cartographic calculations he made with his homemade micrometer. He's being exact and empirical, showing the exact measurements of the features of the moon. So here's my favorite drawing of this figure. Here's another one of this figure. but look at the same time at his detailed, in fact, here it is in color from my photograph, his detailed calculations of his empirical observations with a micrometer. Close observation is being put in the service of both truth and beauty. There's a combination of art and science, grace and precision in his observations, and religious devotion too. With its delicately feathered wings, Russell's Moon Maiden uniquely merges into the figure of an angel. This may have been an element of fancy, and it would not be beyond the sensibility, but it would not be beyond the sensibility of an artist who is lost in wonder, love, and praise. Surely there is devotion at work here too. I think he simply couldn't help himself. This certainly was the evangelical attitude toward the world revealed by science from the very beginning. It communicates the same message as the figure of devotion in James Harvey. At the center of the modern scene between natural philosophy and astronomy, this figure could stand nicely for Russell as for Edwards and Wesley and most of the other early evangelicals. In their concern for true religion, friends, they simply could not banish God's presence from the modern world. On the contrary, science, when viewed properly, was to rise to wonder, love, and praise. Thank you.
Somewhere along the line, you give us 18th century evangelicalism hand in hand with science, embracing it, being edified by it, etc. Yet today, there's a perception in the world that evangelicalism is at odds with science. What happened? And I know that's like a 10-hour course. But give us a thumbnail of what's happened.
Well, I won't give the typical historian's answer, which is not my period. But I think perhaps there were different issues raised by geology and by biology in the 19th century, and more challenges to the ideas of design in the universe, being able to see design in the universe, and that took a different kind of reckoning. So I think it is a long story, and it's not that there was never moments where Christianity and science are in warfare, but the idea that it is just universally so, or that it is just inevitably so. I think each episode in the history of science has required Christians to be thoughtful. What have we got wrong? How do we understand this? Wesley had a kind of, the phrase I use in the book is he had a kind of epistemological reserve. He embraced it all, but he was not too quick just to jump on bandwagons, but to pause and to think about it. I think that's the exemplary response. But I think part of what happens in the 19th century is a phrase that the historian Reg Ward uses, is evangelicals gave up on the larger project of trying to discern the harmony of all knowledge, and their identity instead was kind of rallied around simply a core of central doctrines without general intellectual context. So I think what happens is fragmentation. There's more fragmentation in knowledge, and partly as scientific knowledge expands, it becomes harder, even within the original view of natural philosophy, as the unity of all knowledge. But as specialization happens, it becomes harder to do. I think it's a long story with many twists. But when I think part of what happens is as Christians begin to believe that they have to choose, they're made to choose between science and their faith, then sort of well-meaning Christians, I think sometimes accept that, and we find that often in the fundamentalism debates and so on in the 20th century. Yeah.
As scientists, we often report our results in statistics that imply a degree of humility. To a 95% certainty with a 5% chance that we're wrong, a p-value of 5.5. 0.05 technically. Please adduce the role of humility in reconciling modern science and evangelicalism.
I love the story by G.K. Chesterton, where he talks about It's a longer story. You can read. It's called The Hammer of God. But the sort of punchline is, he says, great things are seen from the valley. It's dangerous to meditate from high places. And it's a way of saying that you see greatness. Humility is linked to the capacity to see greatness. And I think that's one of the reasons why I do admire Wesley's, what he calls a kind of epistemological reserve, and the ability not to simply have, it's not simply apodictic certainty, and without that we have complete agnosticism. There is, there are measures of certainty that can be accorded to things. There can be a kind of judgment of this is the current state of knowledge. There's a sense that this is revisable. So I think the instinct of the questioner that this is, that there needs to be a kind of humility even before how much there is that we don't know, I think is a good reminder in both theological matters. What we know is bounded by what we don't know, and as well as in science, and even in the relation of the two. I think that's a useful instinct, humility. The virtues are always at work.
Where does Cotton Mather fit into the picture? I'm thinking especially of the Christian philosopher, which brought the new science to the new world.
Yeah, that's really good. I don't have a whole lot to say about that. I haven't done a lot of work on Cotton Mather, but this is one of the new frontiers right now, because his Magnalia, Cotton Mather's big book, was in the context of biblical commentary. This massive New England brain was going to have a compendium of all knowledge. Can you imagine trying to take on that project now? We maybe better not go back to the previous question about humility. But it was going to be a compendium of all knowledge, all known knowledge, everything in the context of this biblical commentary. So it's a massive editing project, and a lot of the people who've been working on the Jonathan Edwards manuscripts and their transcription and publication for Yale have now moved over to the Magnalia project, and those volumes are coming out. And it's quite a challenging editing task. So I'm not as familiar with the Magnalia, but I think you're right, that is another place to go to look at sort of, Cotton Mather, is he an evangelical? He's kind of one of these figures who's an evangelical before the revival, a kind of hinge figure between Puritanism and evangelicalism, but he certainly represents a kind of vast curiosity about the world and a desire to relate it to the Bible, and that's his big project. Yeah.
Okay, how does the rise of deism fit into this account?
Right. I think deism, sort of modern deism, is precisely one of the things that emerges from this metaphysical change in the Newtonian world. Is increasingly, it's possible, these are the early 18th century debates. Kind of before the evangelicals come on the scene, deism is debated. Deism is still kind of seen as a threat. There's sort of pinpricks of doubt. The idea that God is the remote kind of cause of the world. And you can see that if you kind of accept this materialist science, and all you have is kind of maybe arguments that God is kind of maybe a remote designer, you kind of have this remote God who kind of fires up the world and sits back and lets sort of causation, efficient causes sort of run the world. And so that becomes, it's really seen by many as the great threat in the 18th century, the great threat to belief. And as people are finding that many of the Newtonians are becoming deists or Arians or giving up on orthodox Christology, it makes some people worried about science. So I've talked about people who embraced it, but there's other people who go the other direction and say, if you do too much of this, you're just going to end up being a deist. So that's one of the big challenges, and it sort of typifies this idea that we have a kind of that God is remote from the world, is no longer vitally a part and sustaining the world at every moment. So even today, you may know some of the literature that talks about most people today are moral therapeutic deists. That's a sort of view of the world that many Christians kind of hold implicitly. God is sort of remote, and you don't see him as a vital part of our everyday lives.
What role does ethics play in the expanding understanding of science and our world? What might be permissible but not beneficial, for example?
Right. So these are huge debates, especially as it seems like we're given godlike powers over, and with technology and involvement of science and so on. Let me give a short response to that in terms of the period that I'm looking at. Natural law comes to have tremendous explanatory power, and people are aware through Newtonian science of the power of this, and it becomes a kind of way of looking at the world that is applied in all sorts of other areas. And so people begin looking for the Newton of the moral sciences. Who will be the Isaac Newton of the moral sciences, who can look at human nature without taking God into consideration and develop an ethics based on just looking at human nature and at the innate moral senses. And so is it Adam Smith? Is it Jean-Jacques Rousseau? Is it David Hume? Who's going to be the Isaac Newton of the moral world? And it's ultimately out of that 18th century moral philosophy that will emerge even the social sciences, a kind of empirical view of human nature. But it's always very tricky to get from is to ought, to try to describe human nature and say this is what we take de facto to be human nature, and then to derive sort of ethics from that. And so there's many ways that the kind of split that we have between kind of fact and value today that makes these discussions very difficult goes back to this period, and it's a kind of vector of the Newtonian revolution in how people begin to think about ethics. So they begin to think, so it's another version of that fragmentation rather than seeing things together. What is a just and ordered response to the world? How is the world morally ordered? And Edwards is one of the ones who's trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again so that we can think about these things together. But in terms of the specific ethical challenges, I think, that are being presented by science today, I think there are many. And I think it requires very, very deep thinking about each issue in terms of what it presents to the church, how we return to Scripture, how we think about these things with the expansion of knowledge in so many areas. Yeah.
All right, just a couple more, and I recognize that our time is drawing nigh, but maybe two long and one short. Long number one. Isaac Newton himself was quite focused on theology and Christianity and some interesting ways. Would you consider him among these post-Newton evangelicals? If not, what would you say sets him apart? And it might help to give some background on how Newton was quite focused on theology and Christianity in some interesting ways.
It's interesting, like, was Newton a Newtonian? You have this problem, some people, was Calvin a Calvinist? Newton had enormous speculation on biblical prophecy, and some people felt like even some elements of his system, was there elements of alchemy and so on in his system. And I don't know, certainly for many of these figures, there still is a very vivid religious consciousness, and we have to be careful even when we talk about atheism and these kinds of things today. It's a bit like, when I was in Oxford, I remember in the senior common room, people coming up to me and saying, "Bruce, I want you to know I'm an atheist, but I'm an Anglican atheist." Or I'm an atheist, but I'm a Presbyterian atheist. And I think there's ways that there still is, for many of these figures, that we describe a kind of view of the world in which God is absent. There still is a kind of cultural sense of vivid religious consciousness, and I think Isaac Newton certainly had that. I don't, his apocalyptic and prophetic speculations, I'm not as familiar with all of those, but there's a way that one of the Newtonians is William Whiston, and he begins to create the problem, this Newtonian view of the world of how do you handle biblical miracles and prophecy. Those become two of the big questions. In a sense, they're put onto the table in a new way as how do we fit the Bible into this understanding of the world. So I don't see Newton as having the kind of devotion that these evangelical figures had of seeing God in the world in wonder, love, and praise, quite the way these folks did. But he certainly has a religious consciousness. Yeah.
That's an interesting question, and I'm going to maneuver the wording of it a little bit to I think more directly align with some of your views. So how do you minister to Christians who believe without a doubt that, for example, the Bible claims to be speaking to a world that was created 4004 BC or something like that, if you add up the chronologies and the genealogies? How do you minister to folks like that who take a view of the Bible that will cause them to reject science when you believe the two go hand in hand?
Great question. That's, I think my own approach is usually to try to understand what the issue is under the issue. Like, so is the issue the person feels like they have, if they're to accept this other view, they have to give up on biblical authority. Is that what they're worried about? Are they worried that we no longer believe in a supernatural God and a God who is sovereign over creation? We no longer believe in a God who intervenes to save. Like, what is the concern that's being addressed? So I would say, I want you to know I believe the Bible is the authoritative Word of God. Let's talk about, like, what is it about this view that feels threatening to that? Because I think people are sometimes told there's a kind of domino effect. If you let that domino go, then way over here you're going to find that's the end of biblical authority. So we must be reading the Bible differently. Let me talk about how I would read the Genesis account. And I still I believe this is the authoritative Word of God, and it tells us the one and only true account of the world. And here's how I read it. And so I think you can often do more by, rather than just sort of engaging in debate, to try to understand what is the really precious thing that I feel like is threatened by this, and to address that directly and say, I believe the Bible is the authoritative Word of God. You know?
And simply because the question says I'm interested in Mark's opinions also, I'll throw out one, but I throw it out there with the idea of you to comment on it if you find it useful or disabuse me of it readily if you want. So I studied at Lipscomb, which, did I mention this is being live streamed at Lipscomb? I don't know if I did or not. And I would say to people, I do believe that the Bible is inerrant, but the way I define inerrancy is very important. That it is exactly what, in its original form, what God intended it to be, to communicate to the people to whom it was written. And through that process, we're able to be communicated to from that word as well today. But you should not read it in a way that's contrary to the purposes or the type. So you've got different types of literature in there, and you need to read them for the types of literature that they are. And you need to read them within their original authored context before you take them to ours today. And I think if you do that, the issue of how old the earth is, the Bible was never written to tell the people in the day of Moses how old the earth was. That's not the reason that that's there. And if you try to read it and make that the reason it's there, not only do you misread Scripture and perhaps run in conflict to science and other things and reality, but you miss the richness of Scripture as to why it was written, because you've misread it.
Yeah, exactly. Hear, hear.
Okay, well, that brings up our last question, which is rather short, but it's really, really important because I've been wanting to ask you this a long time. Why do people in Canada pronounce project?
Or my roof, eh? You know, and all these other words. I think, you know, it's the Queen's English, you know? Yeah.
I grew up in Lubbock, and we did run into people occasionally from England, and they would ask me, don't you know the Queen's English? And I would say, well, of course she is.
Well, you know that in Canada we say, do you want to go to a movie, eh? And in New York you say, hey, you want to go to a movie?
Would you join me in thanking the good professor?